Somewhere under the city, right now, a litre of water is moving. It is moving through a pipe the width of a train tunnel. It passed through a sand filter an hour ago. Before that, it sat in a tank. And before that, 3 days ago, it was somewhere else entirely. In a river, in a sky, in another country. Follow that litre far enough, and you leave the island. This is a city of almost 6 million people. It has no river large enough to supply it, no natural lake worth the name, no groundwater it can reach. The rain that falls here, and a great deal falls, more than twice the world average, runs off concrete and out to sea before the land can hold it, because there is barely any land to hold it with. It has no oil, no gas, no coal, nothing under the ground that burns. It grows almost none of its own food. More than 9 in every 10 things eaten here arrived by ship or by plane, from 187 different countries. And a quarter of the ground itself, the actual earth people stand on, was not here a lifetime ago. It was bought, by the ton, from somewhere else. By every measure that usually decides whether a place can survive, this one should not. And yet, this is one of the richest places on Earth. The highest income per person in Asia, among the highest anywhere. The water comes out of the tap, clean, every hour of every day. The power has not failed in living memory. The food is on the shelves. The lights of the harbour do not go out. Both things are true at the same time. A city with nothing of its own, and a city that runs more reliably than almost any other on the planet. The question is not how it got rich. That is the story most people tell, and it is the wrong story. The question is how it stays alive at all, every single day, and why the staying alive is the same thing as the wealth. How does a place with no water of its own keep the water running? Singapore is small, smaller than most people imagine. About 730 square kilometers, a single city that is also a whole country, sitting at the bottom tip of mainland Asia, where the continent runs out and the sea begins. There are no mountains. The highest point is a hill called Bukit Timah, 164 meters of green at the center of the island, lower than many of the towers that surround it. There is no great river. There is no plain to farm, no valley to mine, no field of anything. What there is position. Singapore sits at the throat of the Strait of Malacca, the narrow channel of water that every ship traveling between the Indian Ocean and the Pacific must pass through, or else sail thousands of kilometers around. For 2 centuries, the island has lived on that fact. It is the place where the world's cargo stops to breathe. But position does not give you water. Position does not feed you. Position does not keep the lights on. For everything else, Singapore had to build a system. Not one system, many, layered on top of each other, each one covering for the weakness of the last. And the whole arrangement holds together only because every part is carrying every other part. Remove one piece, and you do not get a smaller city. You get no city at all. Start with the water. It is the oldest problem here and the deepest. When the British mapped this island, the water came from the obvious place, the land just to the north. A short stretch of sea separates Singapore from the Malaysian state of Johor. Across that water, a river runs, the Johor River. And in 1927, and again in 1961, and again in 1962, the city signed agreements to draw that river's water and pipe it south, across a causeway, into Singapore. The 1962 agreement is the one that still matters. It lets Singapore take up to 250 million gallons of raw water a day from the Johor River. For this, Singapore pays 3 cents, 3 Malaysian cents, for every 1,000 gallons. A price set in 1962 and never changed since. And here is the first strange turn in the story. In return, Singapore is required to sell water back. Treated, clean drinking water piped north into Johor, sold at 50 cents per 1,000 gallons, a fraction of what it costs Singapore to clean it. So the city buys raw water cheap, cleans it at great expense, and sells some of it back at a loss. Why a city would build its survival on a deal like that, and what it costs to keep that deal alive, is something we will come back to. Because there is a date attached to all of this. The 1962 agreement expires in 2061. After that, there is no guarantee, no automatic renewal, nothing. When Singapore became a country, suddenly and not by choice, the men running it understood exactly what that meant. Singapore is expelled from Malaysia. Overnight, the island is a sovereign state of 2 million people with almost no fresh water of its own, depending for its survival on a river that now sits in a foreign country. The man who leads it does not treat this as a plumbing problem. He treats it as the central fact of national survival. Every other plan, every road, every factory, every school is built around a single unspoken condition. The water must keep coming, and one day it must come from nowhere but here. That was the goal set in those first years, to make the island able to supply its own water, completely, before the 2061 clock runs out. It sounds impossible. An island with no river, no lake, no aquifer, becoming self-sufficient in water. What they built instead was 4 taps. The first tap is rain. Singapore cannot store rain in a valley because there is no valley. So it turned the city itself into the catchment. 2/3 of the entire island, roads, rooftops, car parks, drains, is engineered to collect rainwater and channel it through a network of canals and waterways into 17 reservoirs scattered across the land. The most remarkable of these sits in the middle of the city. Where a river once emptied into the sea at Marina Bay, engineers built a barrier across the river mouth, a barrage, a wall with gates. When the tide is low, the gates open and rainwater drains out to sea. When heavy rain threatens to flood the low-lying centre, giant pumps push the excess water out against the tide. And over years, the seawater trapped behind the wall was flushed out and replaced by rain, until the bay in the heart of downtown became a freshwater reservoir, a lake ringed by skyscrapers that the city drinks from. The catching of the rain is its own quiet engineering. A flat, low island hit by tropical downpours that can drop a month of rain in an afternoon should flood. For a long time, parts of it did. So the city was cut through with canals and drains, a hard grey skeleton to rush the water off the streets and toward the reservoirs before it could pool. But concrete drains are ugly, and they waste the water by hurrying it away. So Singapore began, slowly, to soften them, widening canals into planted streams, turning a straight concrete channel through one neighbourhood into a winding river with reeds and banks, where children play at the water's edge on a dry day, and which swells to carry the flood on a wet one. The same channel, made to do two jobs, drain the city and be a place worth living beside. And under the busiest district, out of sight, sit tanks the size of cathedrals, chambers that fill with stormwater when the rain comes hardest, so the surface above stays dry. The city floods downward into the dark on purpose, so it does not flood upward into the streets. But rain is not enough. In a dry month, the reservoirs fall, and so the system reaches for the second tap, the imported river in Johor. And when even that is not enough, it reaches for the two taps that no weather can touch. The third tap is the strangest thing this city does, and to understand it, you have to be willing to think about where used water goes. In most cities, when water disappears down a drain, it is gone, treated and released into a river or the sea. A one-way trip. Singapore could not afford a one-way trip, so it built a loop. Deep beneath the island runs a tunnel, wide, sloping, fed entirely by gravity, that gathers the city's used water and carries it, without a single pump along most of its length, to vast reclamation plants at the edge of the sea. There, the water is cleaned the way any city would clean it, and then it is cleaned again. First, it is forced through membranes so fine they strain out bacteria and solids. Then it is pushed, under enormous pressure, through a second set of membranes, reverse osmosis, with pores so small that only water molecules slip through. Viruses, salts, chemicals, every contaminant left behind. What passes through is water so pure it is almost stripped. A final pass under ultraviolet light kills anything that could conceivably remain. The result has a name: Newwater, and it is among the cleanest water on the planet. Cleaner than the water in the reservoirs, cleaner than the water most of the world drinks. It is also, a few days earlier, the water that went down the city's drains. Remember that the purest water in Singapore begins as its dirtiest. We will see why that matters more than it sounds. In 2002, to prove the point, the government did something deliberate and theatrical. On the nation's birthday, 60,000 people gathered for the national parade and raised bottles of Newwater in a toast. The Prime Minister drank his on camera. It was an act of engineering disguised as a celebration, designed to do one thing: make a population comfortable with drinking water that, not long before, had been sewage. It worked. Today, Newwater can meet up to 40% of the country's demand. Most of it goes to industry, to the semiconductor plants whose machines need water even purer than people do. The rest is blended quietly back into the reservoirs. The man most closely tied to this, to the decades of patient engineering that turned the idea from a discarded 1970s experiment into the spine of a nation's water supply, was an engineer named Tan G. Paw. For years, he chaired the agency that runs the water. He is not a household name. The system he helped build is invisible by design. You only notice water like this when it stops. And the system does not only make water, it governs how much is used. Water here is priced to tell the truth. Most of the world prices water at the cost of pulling it from a nearby river. Almost nothing. Singapore prices it to reflect what the next drop actually costs to produce, from the sea or from the recycling plant, and then adds a tax on top, deliberately, to make waste expensive. The price is a message. This is scarce. Treat it so. Fittings are rated for efficiency by law. The largest users must account for every cubic meter. The habit of not wasting water is engineered into the population the way the membranes are engineered into the plants. Because a system that must manufacture its own water cannot only build supply forever. At some point, the cheapest liter is the one nobody uses. So the city shapes the demand as carefully as it builds the supply. Two hands on the same problem, pushing from both sides. The fourth tap is the sea itself. Singapore is an island. It is surrounded by water it cannot drink, until it spends the energy to make it drinkable. In 5 desalination plants along the coast, seawater is pushed through membranes under pressure, and the salt is driven out. And what comes through is fresh. It works. It is reliable. It does not depend on rain or on a foreign river. And it has one weakness that runs underneath this entire story. It costs an enormous amount of power. To make a single cubic meter of water from the sea takes around 3.5 kilowatt hours of electricity. And engineers have spent years trying to push that number down. Because every drop of water the city manufactures is, in the end, a drop of electricity. This is the bargain at the heart of the water system, and it never quite goes away. Rain is cheap but unreliable. The river is reliable but borrowed. Recycled water and water from the sea are reliable and Singapore's own, but they are expensive and hungry for power. Every step toward water independence is a step deeper into energy dependence. The city cannot have one kind of security without spending another. Water, power, money. It can only balance them, never escape them all at once. Which raises the obvious question. If the water runs on power, where does the power come from? This is where the system folds back on itself, and the first dependency reveals the second. Singapore makes almost all of its own electricity. The plants are here, on the island, humming day and night. By that measure, the power is secure. But look at what they burn. Around 95% of Singapore's electricity comes from a single fuel: natural gas. Not coal, not oil, not nuclear, not the sun. Gas. One fuel, carrying nearly the entire grid. And not one molecule of that gas comes from Singapore. The island has no gas of its own. About 40% of it arrives through pipelines run under the sea and across the land from Malaysia and Indonesia. The rest arrives frozen. To turn gas into something a ship can carry, you chill it to minus 160 degrees until it shrinks into a liquid 600 times smaller than its gas form. That liquid, liquefied natural gas, is loaded onto specialized tankers and sailed across the world to a terminal on the edge of Singapore, where it is warmed back into gas and fed into the grid. So the city that powers its own water depends, for that power, on tankers, on pipelines crossing borders, on a fuel it must buy from somewhere else every single day. Forever. Remember the 95%. Because a system that runs almost entirely on a fuel it does not have is a system that is only ever as safe as the route that fuel travels. And in 2026, that route was tested. When conflict flared in the Middle East and shipping through the Strait of Hormuz was disrupted, a fifth of the world's frozen gas was suddenly traveling through a choke point at war. Singapore had been buying some of its gas from Qatar. Now those cargoes were at risk. The response was quiet and fast. A new state company, created the year before in 2025 for exactly this purpose, stepped in to centralize the buying and began sourcing frozen gas from further afield, from anywhere the sea routes were still open. The lights did not flicker. Most people in the city never knew. But the lessons sat there, plain. A grid that runs on one fuel from far away is a grid living on the goodwill of distant straits. And so, even now, Singapore is trying to escape its own dependency. There are floating solar farms, vast rafts of panels across the reservoirs, because there is no spare land for them on the ground. One of them, on Tenga Reservoir, carries more than 120,000 panels. There are plans to run undersea cables thousands of kilometers to import clean power, solar from the deserts of Australia, hydropower from the rivers of Laos, electricity from Indonesia and Cambodia and Vietnam. There is even open talk now, after decades of ruling it out, of small nuclear reactors. All of it points at the same horizon, the same goal as the water: to one day need no one. But that day is not here. Today, the power runs on gas the island does not own, which makes the water, in the end, run on it too. And both of them run on something even more basic: the ability to bring things across the sea. Which brings us to the harbour. If you stand on the southern coast at night and look out, you see them. Ships. Hundreds of them, anchored in the dark, lights strung across the water to the horizon. At any given moment, around 1,000 vessels are in Singapore's waters. This is the busiest transshipment port on Earth. Not the busiest at loading a country's own goods. Singapore is far too small to fill that many ships. The busiest at moving other people's cargo. A container arrives from one part of the world, is lifted off, set down, and lifted onto a different ship bound for somewhere else. Roughly a fifth of all the world's transshipped containers pass across these docks. Around 40 million of them a year. It is also where the world's ships come to drink. Singapore is the largest bunkering port on Earth, the place where more vessels take on fuel than anywhere else. A ship crossing half the world will plan its voyage around stopping here to refuel, the way a traveller plans around a service station. The island that has no fuel of its own sells fuel to the fleets of the world. And here is the contradiction at the center of the harbour. Almost none of what passes through is for Singapore. The island consumes a tiny fraction of the goods on those ships. It is not the destination, it is the junction. The cargo of the world flows in, pauses for a matter of hours, and flows out again. And from that pause, from being the place where the world's trade catches its breath, the city makes a living. At the western edge of the island, a new kind of port is taking over. Tuas. When it is finished, it will be the largest fully automated container terminal in the world. There are no drivers. Battery-powered vehicles, close to 1,000 of them, carry containers between the quay and the yard, navigating by themselves. Towering cranes, run from control rooms, lift boxes off the ships and stack them with no hand on the controls. The whole terminal will one day handle 65 million containers a year, and much of it will run in something close to silence. But automation does not remove the dependency, it sharpens it. In 2024 and into 2025, the world's shipping fell out of rhythm. Vessels arrived late, then arrived all at once. Ships waited days to find a berth. At one point, hundreds of thousands of containers sat offshore, waiting. And because Singapore is the junction, because so much of the world's cargo routes through this single point, a delay here did not stay here. It rippled outward, down the shipping lanes to Europe, to the Middle East, to Africa, tangling schedules a continent away. That is what it means to be a choke point. The same position that makes the city rich makes the city a single point that the world's trade leans on. And it raises a quiet question, the kind that sits at the back of the mind. The whole of Singapore's life, its fuel, its food, the materials it builds with, comes across this water, through this strait, past this port. What happens to all of it if the strait ever closes? Hold that one, we will need it at the end. And it is not only cargo that routes through here, it is the world's words. Along the seabed off Singapore's coast lie cables no thicker than a garden hose, buried in the sand and laid across the floor of the sea. Fiber optic lines, the physical internet, the messages and the money and the video of half a continent travel as pulses of light through glass, and a remarkable share of all of it, between Asia and Europe, between one part of Asia and another, passes through this one place. The same position that made the island the junction of the world's ships made it the junction of the world's data. The cargo pauses here for hours. The light pauses for 1,000th of a second, long enough to be switched, sorted, sent on. And where the data lands, the machines that hold it follow. Vast halls of computers cluster on the island, humming, processing, remembering, the warehouses of the digital trade. But they are ravenous. A single large data hall can draw as much power as a small town, run it day and night, and pour out heat into an already hot city. For a time, Singapore had to stop building new ones at all. The island simply did not have the spare power, the spare land, or the spare cooling to feed them. The digital junction ran straight into the same wall as everything else. There is only so much of an island. And consider for a moment who all of this is for. Nearly everyone in Singapore, around 8 in 10 people, lives in public housing. Not as a stopgap, not as a last resort, but as the ordinary way of things. Blocks of flats, built by the state, sold to the people who live in them. A whole population housed by a single deliberate system, stacked upward because there is no room to spread out. The flats hold the people, and the people have to move. A city this dense, millions of lives pressed into a space you could drive across in under an hour, would choke on its own traffic in a morning if it leaned on cars alone. So beneath the streets runs another network. Trains, threading the island, carrying millions of journeys a day on a timetable measured in minutes. A signal fault at one junction in the morning rush does not stay at that junction. It backs up down the line, station after station, until a single delay is felt by 100,000 people who were nowhere near it. And over all of it hangs the heat. Singapore sits almost on the equator. It is hot, and it is humid every day of the year. A city this size, working at this pace, in this climate, runs on one quiet, constant thing: the moving of heat out of rooms. Air conditioning here is not a luxury, it is infrastructure. The man who led Singapore for its first decades once called it among the most important inventions for the place, the thing that made it possible to work and think and build through the tropical afternoon. But cooling is electricity. Every cooled office, every cooled train, every cooled flat draws on the grid that runs on gas the island does not have. The hotter the day, the heavier the draw, so even the act of keeping cool ties back through the wires to a tanker somewhere out at sea, carrying frozen fuel toward a small, bright island that cannot stop needing it. And the movement does not stop at the water's edge. Every morning before dawn, a tide of people crosses the narrow strait from Johor into Singapore. Over the causeway, the same causeway the water pipes run along. Hundreds of thousands of them on one of the busiest land borders on Earth. Workers who live in Malaysia, where rent and food cost less, and work in Singapore, where the wages are higher. They cross in. At night, they cross back. Trucks come the other way through the dark, loaded with vegetables and fish and chickens for the morning markets. So the same thin channel that carries half the city's water also carries a share of its workforce and a share of its food. 3 lifelines, braided together across one strait, between one city and the neighbor it depends on, bargains with, and cannot do without. It is the oldest pattern in the whole story, drawn again. Singapore reaches across a border for the thing it lacks, and ties one more cord between its own survival and a place beyond its control. Just offshore, the harbour does something even stranger than move the world's cargo. It manufactures the island's fuel. There is an island within the island, Jurong Island, on the southwest coast. But it was not always one island. It was once 7 small islands and a scatter of rocks sitting in shallow water. Engineers filled the water between them. They merged the islands into a single landmass and covered it in steel. On an island with not one drop of its own oil, they built one of the world's great centers for refining it. Crude arrives by tanker from across the world. It is split, cracked, and rebuilt into fuels and chemicals, and then much of it leaves again, sold on. Singapore became one of the top oil trading and refining hubs on the planet without possessing any oil at all. It is the same trick as the harbour, performed with chemistry. The island does not own the resource, it owns the process. It is the place where other people's raw material is turned into something worth more, and it takes its cut of the difference. And notice what Jurong Island is underneath the steel. It is made ground, land that was sea, which is the 4th dependency hiding under all the others. Because Singapore did not only run out of water and fuel and food, it ran out of itself. When the British charted this island, it was about a quarter smaller than it is today. The Singapore on the map now is, in a real and physical sense, larger than the Singapore that existed a lifetime ago. The city did not grow by discovering new land. It grew by importing the ground. Where that ground came from, and what it cost the places it came from, is a darker thread, and we will pull it shortly. First, follow the loop one turn further. Because all of this, the water, the power, the port, the made land, exists to support the simplest need of all. People here have to eat. More than 90% of Singapore's food is imported. Not from one place, that would be a single point of failure, and this is a country built to fear single points of failure. From 187 countries. Rice from Thailand and India, eggs and vegetables from Malaysia, meat from Brazil and Australia, fish from the region and beyond. And not all of it comes by sea. A great deal of it flies. At the eastern end of the island, one of the world's busiest airports is not only a gateway for travelers, it is a mouth for the city. Chilled fish, fresh fruit, flowers, anything that cannot wait for a slow ship, lands by air and is on the shelves within hours. The same airport that moves travelers through Singapore by the tens of millions quietly moves the freshest of its food in beneath their feet. The strategy is the strategy of the whole island, applied to the plate. Never depend on one source. Spread the risk so wide that no single country, no single failed harvest, no single closed border can empty the shelves. But spread wide is not same as safe. In 2022, when one neighbor halted its chicken exports, Singaporeans felt it within days. At the stalls, in the price of a plate of chicken rice, a dish so woven into the city's identity that its sudden cost became national news. The same year, a war in Europe disrupted the world's grain, and the cost of feeding chickens rose, and the price of eggs rose with it, thousands of kilometers away. On a global ranking of food security, Singapore had sat at the very top. And then, across a few hard years of pandemic and war and broken supply chains, it fell, from first down toward the 30s. Not because anything inside the country changed, because the world outside it shook, and a country that imports almost everything feels every tremor. So Singapore built buffers. There is a national rice stockpile. Importers are required by law to hold a reserve, so that if the ships stopped tomorrow, the city would not run out at once. Over the years, the list of stockpiled food has quietly grown. Frozen protein, canned vegetables, a hidden larder under the city. And there is the harder, slower project, to grow some of it here. Less than 1% of Singapore's land is set aside for farming. There is no room for fields, so the farms went upward and indoors. In one vertical farm, racks of vegetables climb 14 tiers toward the ceiling. Water and nutrients recirculated through the system, using a fraction of the water a field would, producing hundreds of kilograms of greens a day in a space smaller than a basketball court. The goal was given a name, 30 by 30, to grow 3/10 of the country's nutritional needs at home by the year 2030. To carve a buffer of self-sufficiency out of an island with no soil to spare. It has been hard. The eggs came closest. The vegetables and the fish lagged far behind, a few percent, no more. Some of the high-tech farms struggled and failed. And by 2025, the government quietly admitted the target needed rethinking, that on an island this starved of land, growing food locally would have to be more surgical, more targeted than the first hopeful plan had imagined. A new chapter of the strategy was written. The search for buffers runs to stranger places too. Among the foods Singapore has now approved for the table are more than a dozen species of insect, crickets and their kind, protein grown in a fraction of the space and water that livestock demand. A hedge, however small, against a future in which the old ways of feeding a city no longer stretch far enough. The honesty in that admission is the system speaking plainly. Singapore can engineer its water out of the sea and its land out of the seabed. But food is biology, and biology needs space and light and time, and those are the things this island has the least of. Now pull the dark thread, the ground. To grow by a quarter, Singapore needed fill, rock and earth and, above all, sand. Millions upon millions of tons of it, dumped into shallow water and shaped into new coastline. The port at Tuas stands on it. Jurong Island stands on it. Whole districts stand on it. But Singapore has no sand, so it bought it from its neighbors by the shipload. And the sand had to come from somewhere. It came from the seabeds and the islands of Indonesia and from the coast of Malaysia, dredged up, carried away, and poured into the growing edge of Singapore. In Indonesia, the consequences were not abstract. Small islands, low, sandy, inhabited, were dredged until they thinned and, in some cases, vanished beneath the water entirely. Coastlines eroded. Fishermen lost their grounds. The sand that became Singapore's new districts was, somewhere across the strait, a place that no longer exists. One by one, the neighbors closed the tap. Indonesia banned the export of its sand. Years later, Malaysia did the same. The supply that built the city was cut off by the places it had been taken from, places that had watched their own shores disappear to make new shores here. This is the part of the story the gleaming skyline does not tell. The island grew, but the ground it grew with was subtracted from somewhere else, and the people of those somewheres did not always get a say. And the new land brings its own reckoning, because the same engineering that pushed Singapore out into the sea now has to defend it against the sea. As the water rises with the warming climate, an island this low and this flat is exposed along every edge. So the plans now turn to a new kind of reclamation, not for more space, but for protection. A long barrier of raised land off the eastern coast, designed to hold back a sea that is climbing toward the city it helped build. The defense and the vulnerability are the same act. The city reclaims the sea to escape the sea. And there is the question every city would rather not ask. Where does all of it go when it is used up, worn out, thrown away? Singapore has almost no land to bury anything in, so it burns. Most of the city's rubbish goes into waste-to-energy plants, furnaces that incinerate it, shrinking a day's waste to a small fraction of its size and capturing the heat to make a little more electricity for the grid. The trick of the place, again, take a problem and make it carry part of its own weight. But burning leaves ash, and the things that will not burn have to go somewhere. So Singapore did the only thing left to a place with no spare ground. It built a landfill in the sea. Off the southern coast, engineers ran a rock wall between two small islands, sealed the water out, and turned the enclosed lagoon into a pit for the city's ash. An island made partly of what Singapore has burned. The country's only landfill, and it sits offshore on the water. And here is the strange grace of it. The wall held the sea out so well, and the ash was managed so carefully, that mangroves grow there now, and birds nest, and the water around it runs clear. A rubbish dump that looks, from a passing boat, like a nature reserve. The city's ending, engineered to resemble a beginning. And behind every one of these systems sits one more, the oldest and least visible of all: the planning. Singapore decides what its land and its coastline will be used for, not years ahead, but decades, half a century at a time. Space is reserved on the map for reservoirs not yet built, for rail lines not yet needed, for power plants and ports, and whole new districts that exist for now only as intentions. On an island this small, every square meter is spoken for twice. Once for what it is, and once for what it will have to become. It is the habit of a place that has never been able to assume tomorrow will resemble today. A city that plans in 50-year arcs because it learned at its founding that the alternative is to be caught short with no room left to move. Step back for a moment from the machinery. It is easy, listening to all this, to picture Singapore as a machine and nothing more. Pipes and grids and automated cranes. A city run by systems, for systems. But every one of those systems has a hand on it. In a control room somewhere on the island, at 3 in the morning, an operator watches a wall of screens. Flows of water, loads on the grid, pressures, levels, alarms that have not sounded. The city sleeps because that person does not. And when the rest of Singapore wakes and turns on a tap, the water is there, not by magic and not by luck, but because a system held through the night and someone watched it hold. And there is a layer beneath even that one. The hands that physically built the new land, that pour the concrete, that work the docks and the construction sites. Many of them belong to workers who came from elsewhere, from across South Asia and beyond, far from their own families, to do the labor the visible city rests on. For a long time, that layer stayed invisible, until 2020, when a virus moved through the crowded dormitories where many of those workers lived, and a city that prided itself on control was forced to see, all at once, how much of its machine ran on people it had largely kept out of sight. We call what Singapore built a miracle. It is the easy word, and it is the wrong one. A miracle is something that happens to you. This happened on purpose. Every reservoir, every membrane, every grain of imported sand, decided and paid for and maintained by people, some of them celebrated, many of them never named. And the wild has its own quiet answer to all of it. In the engineered waterways, the reservoirs, the canals lined with concrete, the cleaned-up rivers running through the heart of the city, families of smooth-coated otters have returned. They were nearly gone from here. Now they swim in the freshwater reservoir downtown, fish in the canals, raise their young along the manicured banks, threading between the joggers and the towers. They did not come back because the city left them wild land. There is almost none. They came back because the water got clean enough to live in. The same system built to keep people alive, by accident, made room for them. Life, finding the seam in the machine. So, 4 taps for water, 1 fuel for power, a harbour that is the junction of the world, land bought by the ton, food gathered from 187 countries and stockpiled against the day the ships stop. Layer upon layer, each one covering the weakness of the last. A city with nothing of its own, holding itself up by holding every part of itself together. But every system, however deep, however clever, comes down in the end to a weakest point. A single place where, if you pressed, the whole thing would feel it. For Singapore, that point is not in Singapore at all. Go back to the water, to the imported tap, the river in Johor, just across the strait. Half of Singapore's water has long come from that one river. And here is the thing about that river that almost no one outside the trade understands. The river is tidal. Near its mouth, the sea pushes inland. When the weather is dry or the tide is high, salt water creeps up the channel, and salt water cannot be made drinkable by the works downstream. If the river turns salty at the point where Singapore draws from it, the tap, in effect, closes. Not because the water is gone, because the sea has reached in and spoiled it. To stop that from happening, Singapore built something. Far upstream, deep in the Malaysian interior, it dammed a river and made a reservoir. The Linggau Reservoir. Its job is strange and singular. It does not supply water to Singapore directly. It holds rainwater in reserve, high up the system. And when the dry season comes and the sea begins to push up the Johor River, Linggyu releases its stored water downstream, sending a flush of fresh water down the channel to drive the salt back toward the sea. It keeps the river fresh enough, long enough, for Singapore to draw from it. The whole imported tap, half the water of a great city, depends on that one reservoir doing that one quiet job of holding back the sea with stored rain. And here is the turn this entire story has been moving toward. Singapore built the Linggyu Reservoir. Singapore paid for it, more than $300 million in construction and compensation. Singapore operates the drawing of the water. The whole arrangement keeps the city alive. But Singapore does not own it. The reservoir sits inside Malaysia, on Malaysian land. The dam belongs to Johor. The most important single piece of infrastructure for Singapore's water supply, the keystone the imported tap rests on, is a reservoir in another country, on land Singapore leased, built on the strength of an agreement that runs out in 2061. Now you can see why the deal looked so strange at the start. Why Singapore buys raw water for 3 cents and sells treated water back at a loss. Why it poured hundreds of millions into a dam it would never own. It was never a good deal on paper. It was survival on paper. It was a city with no water buying the right to keep drinking and paying, in money, in treated water sent back north, in dependency, for every day the river kept flowing. And then, one year, the reservoir nearly failed. A long drought settled over the region. The rain did not come. And the level in the Linggyu Reservoir began to fall, and kept falling. From around 4/5 full, down through the half mark, down past a third. At its worst, the reservoir that holds back the sea for half of Singapore's water dropped to roughly 1/5 of its capacity. Picture it. A nation among the richest on earth, with its gleaming towers and its automated port and its water made from the sea, and the survival of half its drinking water hanging on the level of a reservoir in a foreign forest, watched daily, falling daily, with no power on earth to make it rain. It did not empty, the rains returned. The level recovered. The taps in Singapore never ran dry. Most people there never felt a thing. But everyone whose job it was to watch the water understood what they had seen. They had seen the bottom of the system. The single dependency that all the engineering in the world had not yet escaped. The whole luminous machine, the desalination, the recycled water, the reservoirs, the harbour, the wealth, traced down through every layer to one dam holding rain in another country's hills. That litre of water, from the very beginning, the one moving under the city right now, a good share of its kind began as rain in those hills, held by Linggyu, released to push back the sea, drawn from the river, piped across the causeway, cleaned and cleaned again, and poured at last from a tap in a kitchen, by someone who will never know how far it travelled, or how close, one dry year, it came to not arriving at all. This is what Singapore actually is. Not a miracle of wealth, a structure of dependencies, stacked and braced against each other. Water leaning on power. Power leaning on the sea lanes. The sea lanes leaning on the world staying open. The whole of it balanced, at the very bottom, on a borrowed dam and an agreement with a date on it. And the date is coming. The year the water agreement expires. The year Singapore set itself generations ago to need no one. To make every drop it drinks from its own rain, its own recycling, its own sea. The 4 taps were always a countdown. Newwater and desalination were never just engineering. They were the slow, expensive, decades-long project of cutting the last cord. Of reaching the point where, if the river to the north ever stopped, the city would not even notice. Singapore may make it. By most measures, it is close. It could likely stand alone in water now if it had to, at a cost. That is the achievement, and it is real, and it is enormous. A place that started with nothing of its own has very nearly engineered its way to needing nothing of anyone. But very nearly is the whole story. The agreement still runs out. The gas still arrives by tanker. The food still comes across the sea from 187 countries. The cargo still routes through one strait. The new land still has to be defended from the rising water that made it necessary. The wealth and the vulnerability were never 2 different things. They are one thing seen from 2 sides. The same position that makes the city rich is the same position that leaves it exposed. The same lack of resources that forced it to build these systems is the same lack that means the systems can never quite stop. There is no version of Singapore that is both rich and safe and finished. The richness is the running. The day the systems stop is the day the city stops. And this is the thing the world buys from Singapore in the end. Not its goods, it makes few of its own. Not its resources, it has none. What the world's companies come here for, what they pay a premium to plant their regional headquarters here for, is the one thing the systems produce that nothing else can. Certainty. The water will be there. The power will be there. The ships will move. The contracts will hold. The lights will stay on. In a region full of uncertainty, Singapore manufactured reliability itself and sold it. The systems are not a cost the wealth has to carry. The systems are the product. Most cities can afford to forget how they work. The water comes from a river that has always been there. The food grows in fields over the hill. The power is dug from the ground beneath. They can take it for granted because the ground gave it to them. Singapore cannot forget. It was never given anything. Every drop, every watt, every grain of rice, every square metre of ground had to be reached for, paid for, engineered, and watched. And the watching never ends. That is the secret the skyline keeps. Not how a city got rich, how a city with nothing of its own stays alive, one held breath at a time, and what it costs to keep breathing. No one knows what the year 2061 will bring, whether the agreement is renewed or quietly allowed to lapse because the city no longer needs it, whether the rains hold or the droughts deepen or the sea climbs faster than the walls can rise. What we know is this. Somewhere under the city, right now, a litre of water is moving. And a vast, invisible system is making sure it keeps moving, tonight and tomorrow, and the night after that. It has held so far. Thank you for watching. Until the next journey.